Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Salaam Islamic Center weekly webinar series with Maha Elgenaidi, the Executive Director of ING, Islamic Network Group. And our topic today is countering Islamophobia through education, interfaith-intercultural engagement. ING, Islamic Network Group, is a peace-building organization providing face-to-face education and engagement opportunities that foster understanding of Muslims. And here we have, who is better than to talk about ING, Maha Elgenaidi. If you can tell us a little bit about ING and then our topic. The floor is yours, please.
ING, as you pointed out, is a U.S.-based grassroots peacemaking nonprofit organization that is dedicated to face-to-face education and engagement to foster understanding of Muslims and other misunderstood groups to promote harmony among all people. I'm the founder of the organization, and I started ING about a quarter of a century ago. I was only 12 years old when I did. Kidding. By focusing on educating fellow Americans about Islam and Muslims. And over time, our mission has broadened to include programs that include engagement opportunities with other misunderstood minority groups. And we broadened our scope of work because we recognize that bigotry of all forms stems from ignorance. Islamophobia is not an issue that can be addressed in isolation without also addressing other forms of discrimination. So the model that we use as a foundation for our programs is based on social science studies that have shown that face-to-face engagement with a member of a misunderstood minority group can have significant positive impact on a person with biases against them in as little as 10 minutes by changing their mental attitude and perceptions about that minority group through direct interaction. And this is why we do the work that we do and the way that we do it, which I'm going to go ahead and talk in more detail about later.
Wonderful. And you were telling us about, with the recent changes, how your interaction exploded in the last few weeks.
Yeah. So, of course, we enjoy and prefer to do work in person, face-to-face. But absent that, because of the shelter in place, we've been doing work in response to the current environment online. And subhanAllah, in a matter of a month or a month and a half, we've reached about 250,000 people, which is remarkable in just one and a half months. Now, mind you, this is compared to what we do in a year, which is around 25,000 people we reach face to face. So, moving forward, we're gonna continue doing this work. I think online, especially now that many Americans are very comfortable. I think we've become more comfortable, at least, with with engaging online. In addition to continuing doing work in person, which we may not be able to do for another year until things change in this country around COVID-19.
Wonderful, congratulations!
Thank you.
Now the floor is yours with our topic today: countering Islamophobia through education, interfaith, and cultural engagement. Please.
Yes. So, I wrote something, particularly for this conversation. So let's just go ahead and get started. I want to begin, and I didn't say this, is wishing everyone listening in Ramadan Mubarak, and hoping that you're all having a very peaceful, blessed, and spiritually meaningful Ramadan this year, despite the shelter in place. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, let's get started. So my topic, as was pointed out, is countering Islamophobia through education and interfaith and intercultural engagement. And this is probably one of the most significant conversations Muslim Americans need to have right now, since I believe it will determine the future of Islam in America and the West in relation to our quality of life, civil rights, and the contributions we're able to make to the culture around us, as it will also shape the kind of Islam we live by. Is it an all-inclusive, all-embracing, compassionate, big umbrella Islam that sees itself as being part of the American landscape? where we're Americans of Muslim background that are contributing towards the betterment of America and all Americans? Or do we see ourselves as being a separate, exclusive, and exceptional group or tribe called Muslim Americans or American Muslims, that is, a hyphenated Americans, contributing only to our own kind and those who are like us in the strictness of their traditionalism and orthodoxy? And this is an important question for us to ask. This is how important I think this conversation is. And it could go either way. It could go either way depending on the voices that are the loudest in the community. So naturally, I lean towards the all-inclusive, all-embracing, compassionate, big umbrella Islam that sees itself as being part of the American landscape, where our identity is American, of Muslim background, that are contributing towards the betterment of America and all Americans. And that's because I think that Islam is much more resonant with aspirational American values. And I say aspirational because America, as we all know, if you know history, hasn't always lived up to those values. And I also think that vision of Islam is what will guarantee our civil rights and allow us to contribute fully to the project of the United States of America, which I believe is exceptional. And this is where my patriotism as an American resides. I think America is very special in its freedoms and its culture that provides independence and opportunities for self-growth and development to be what you aspire to be, despite the caveat that America hasn't lived up to that ideal for all Americans, a reality that we're going to address in just a moment, because it's an important thing to keep in mind. But let's begin with where we're at. Islamophobia should concern us, especially under this current administration. But the issue surpasses, let's be realistic here and let's be honest, the issue surpasses any one administration because the problem is deeply rooted in American culture. So it's going to keep coming up, keep being recycled if we don't do anything about it or if we do the wrong thing. Let's begin first with defining what Islamophobia is for anyone that's going to be listening in or that is listening in right now. Technically, the term Islamophobia appears to have been first used in 1923, but came into wide currency through a report by the Runnymede Trust in Great Britain in 1997 that recently updated its definition of Islamophobia to mean anti-Muslim racism, which I think is a great definition. The longer technical definition of Islamophobia is any distinction, exclusion, or restriction towards or preference against Muslims or those perceived to be Muslims, like Sikhs and other groups, that has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. That definition, in my view, is quite accurate because it's not saying that Islamophobia just means that you have negative perceptions about Islam and Muslims. Having negative perceptions about Muslims is called stereotyping Muslims, right? What Runnymede is saying is that Islamophobia is systemic racism. Systemic racism. Now, we know that Muslims are not a race. We are a religious group that is made up of hundreds of ethnic groups. But what is meant by defining Islamophobia as racism is that the effect of Islamophobia is the same as racism towards a racialized group like African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, or Native Americans. And that Muslims, despite all of our ethnic, cultural, and national diversities, have been racialized. We're seen as defined solely by their embrace of Islam, which is then defined or framed in the following 5 ways. And this is important. This is the way that Muslims and Islam are usually portrayed in the media and in the public square. Islam is usually seen as a monolithic block, static, doesn't change, unresponsive to change. So although Islam has been living and growing and changing over 1,400 years, it's seen as static, not moving. Okay? Islam, number two, Islam is also seen as separate and other, that it doesn't have values in common with other cultures, is not affected by them, does not influence them. Three, Islam is seen as inferior to the West, barbaric, irrational, primitive, sexist. Four, Islam is often seen as violent, aggressive, threatening, supportive of terrorism, engaged in a clash of civilizations, doesn't get along with anyone, with Jews, with Christians in particular. And five, and this is recent, Islam is seen as a political ideology used for political or military advantage. This last claim is particularly dangerous that we need to watch for, because it can be a basis, and it has been a basis, for claiming that Islam and Muslims should not enjoy the same constitutional rights as other religious groups in the United States. Now, these five frames that I just mentioned are incredibly important, because any work that you do around education, interfaith engagement, needs to take these frames in mind, where you're trying to, counter them in the work that we do, and ING certainly does. Should this concern us? Absolutely. Because not only does it lead to hate crimes against us and our property, but it also leads to harassment on the streets, or while we're shopping in grocery stores or at the mall, bullying of our children in schools, discrimination in the workplace, in housing. You're going out to look for a place to buy or to rent, in the legal system, in healthcare delivery, and elsewhere. It absolutely impacts our quality of life. Several organizations have documented this. PAIR, Muslim Advocates, Southern Poverty Law Center, even media organizations have tracked things like hate crimes against mosques, finding, for instance, that on average 12 mosques are attacked or vandalized each month. This is an outrage. This is an epidemic, completely unacceptable. We should not accept our being treated this way. It's wrong. It's un-American. It's dangerous. And this bigotry continues even under a pandemic. So to give you but one example, in the media, Muslims or Islam have been directly associated with the coronavirus through images of mosques in Turkey and women in hijab that were featured in articles about COVID-19 that had absolutely nothing to do with Turkey or Muslims or Islam. But this is not new. I just attended an online seminar at Stanford with Professor Varlik of Rutgers University. I don't know if she's Turkish. She might be Turkish, who pointed out that Europeans have always viewed the Ottomans or Muslims as the source of all plagues throughout Ottoman history, right? And it continues to this day. And that's the context that we need to understand this in. Why else should Islamophobia concern us? Well, because it impacts popular culture, as I alluded to, and also government policies, both domestic and foreign. And I don't think that a lot of Muslims are aware of this. Some of the impact on popular culture, education, ask your kids what they're studying about Islam. Muslim history is distorted, simply erased. We do a presentation on Muslim contributions to civilization because it's not really fully addressed at all in K through 12. The representation of Muslims in textbooks and other educational material is heavily stereotyped. Media, according to a lot of studies, it has shown that more than 80% of television media coverage of Islam and Muslims in the United States is negative, 80%. And coverage of Muslims is both the most frequent and the most negative of other minority groups, primarily because Muslims are most frequently mentioned in reporting on foreign conflict zones. And this is not just Fox News. You'll see it. Studies have actually shown that other networks have worse coverage than what is in Fox News. I don't want to misquote it. So I'm not going to mention the other networks, but Fox's like one of the top three, where Muslims are not portrayed in a balanced way. Terror attacks by Muslims get 357% more media coverage than other terror attacks, and acts of violence are generally labeled as terrorism only when they're committed by Muslims. There's a reason for this, but nevertheless, I think it's important thing to point out. Hollywood has consistently cast Muslims as villains and bad guys since the beginning of the motion picture industry. The internet and social media spread Islamophobia through Islamophobic websites and posts. Fiction and nonfiction, especially post 9/11, cast Muslims as violent, misogynistic, along with other stereotypes. Video games cast Muslims as terrorists or bad guys. We've monitored and tracked all of this, and we can name what these video games are that do this, that are quite popular and played by young people. Some of the impact on foreign policy. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict has always promoted a view of Palestinians as Arabs as violent extremists, and of Muslims, all 2 billion of them, as anti-Semitic, which is insane. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan targeted Muslim-populated nations and peoples, resulting in destruction and killing of thousands of innocent civilians. And you may recall that after the damage was done, we learned that there were no weapons of mass destruction that had served as justification for the assault on Iraq. Domestic policies, the U.S. Patriot Act, which passed after 9/11, for the purpose of preventing terrorism, specifically targeted Muslim Americans at home. It gave law enforcement expanded power to engage in wiretapping, surveillance, searching telephone, email, and financial and library records. And it's been widely criticized for overreach. The War on Terror, which refers to the international campaign against Muslim terrorist groups after 9/11, although supposedly focused mainly overseas, in the United States, it often cast all Muslims as a security threat, resulting in policies like racial profiling of Muslims while flying or traveling, heightened surveillance of Muslims in their houses of worship, and just a general fear that all Muslims are potential terrorists. We've all heard about the anti-Sharia legislation, which has been proposed or passed in 43 states across the country. The travel ban, enacted in 2017 and reinforced to this day, prevents immigration or travel to America by people mainly from Muslim-majority nations, purportedly for security reasons to prevent entry by potential terrorists. Both American foreign policy and media coverage of these stories often show disregard towards human rights violations against millions of Muslims in places like China, Myanmar, Syria, Yemen, and Kashmir, and Palestine. So what all of this means to us personally are many things, but primarily three things. As Muslims, we are defined by these constructed attributes of Islam before we even open our mouth, right? People are frightened of us, especially women in hijab, or if they know that you're Muslim, if you have a Muslim-sounding name. People make decisions about you before you do anything. Hostility towards us is seen as natural and normal. We're the ones left to be objects of hate in this country, right? It's acceptable. It's become acceptable. And any criticism from us is rejected out of hand. And what this means to our children worries me the most. I don't have any children of my own, but I have lots of nephews and nieces that are now married and have their own children, and I have at least 5 children, great grandchildren of my nephews and nieces that range between the age of 3 months to, I think, 3 or 4 years old. And it really worries me that we might not be leaving, a good image of Islam, if we don't get our act right today, what it might do is it might result in these kids leaving Islam altogether or feeling so ashamed of it that they develop a deep-seated inferiority complex, or that they internalize Islamophobia to the degree that they come not only to hate Islam themselves, but to propagate that hate to others. And studies have actually shown that our children have very negative views of their own religion, due not only to Islamophobia, but also due to a failure to address legitimate critiques of Islamic perspectives on such issues as women's rights, women's place in Muslim institutions, sexuality, our view of other faith, or the current state of Muslim countries. So if Islam is so great, our children may ask, then why are Muslims such a mess around the world compared with Europe or China or the United States? Granted, the Muslim world is not in such a mess as one might gather from the general tenor of media reports, but questions about the conditions and policies of a good many Muslim majority countries are certainly legitimate. And closer to home, what about questions about the state of our mosques? If Islam is so great, our children may ask, then why do mosques segregate men from women? Why are they not better kept up? Why do we always hear you complain about politics inside the mosque and so forth? Young people are listening and paying attention, and they're impacted by issues we're not addressing as much as by what they're studying in schools and hearing in the media. And I know that it's affected certainly the generation of my nephews and nieces who are in their 20s and early 30s now. So we should have a sense of urgency about doing right for the next generation, as well as for improving our quality of life today in order to prevent the situation from getting worse. And it certainly has gotten worse from the period between the first Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s, which is when I started getting active, to today in 2020 under this administration. I would say that things have deteriorated pretty severely in the last 30 years in terms of our quality of life as Muslims. So how do we change this trajectory and overcome these challenges? And the answer to that, in my opinion, is that there is no one silver bullet to fighting back. I think we need to do a lot of things at the same time. One very positive thing that has naturally happened is that our kids have gotten older and they're getting into positions of power in politics, both at the state and federal level, which is very exciting. You've all read the statistics of how many Muslims ran for office and how many actually won their seats. It's something like 50 in the last, in the last elections, and we know that we now have 3 Muslims at the federal level. In the number of Muslim reporters and pundits, we now have in every major news organizations, which is very exciting. In Hollywood, they're filmmakers, they're producers, they're writers, they're actors. In the healthcare industry, as doctors and nurses and CEOs of hospitals. I read today that something like 10% of the physicians in New York are Muslim, which is remarkable. They're also in law enforcement at the at the federal, state, and local levels. In education, they're bankers. They're in business as entrepreneurs and CEOs of major corporations and so forth. For example, I just read today or yesterday that 2 Muslims who are corporate CEOs are part of the team leading Silicon Valley's COVID-19 economic recovery, which is amazing. If you look at the list, it's made up of the who's who of Silicon Valley. The top CEOs of the valley, and 2 Muslims out of 2 dozens are part of it, which I was really excited about. So it's really remarkable to watch this transformation in the last 30 years, in the last 30 years, because of this generation, growing up and going into these positions. Is it enough? Have we reached critical mass in this area? No, we haven't, but it's still significant because Muslim professionals in these high-level positions are certainly making a difference, regardless of their small numbers. We're seeing a lot more news articles, for example, that I think present Muslims in a very balanced way, since these young Muslims are now working for these media agencies. But what about other initiatives? that we should be taking to overcome Islamophobia, besides what is naturally unfolding in this generation? So I think two things. And I'm about to close because I know I've been talking a lot. I think two things, and two kinds of initiatives, in my opinion, and both are equally valid and important. And I think also reflect prophetic traditions. The more we do them, the greater the benefit and barakah or blessing in the work. And this is why the intentions of the Muslim activists are incredibly important. Anyone doing this work, and I feel very, very strongly about this, anyone doing this work representing Muslims should be very clear on why they're doing it, so that they reflect our prophetic tradition and Islamic ethics in how they're doing it. And we have a long way to go in this area in terms of Islamic ethics and how we do the work that we do. Now it seems, that this hasn't gotten through to some people or a lot of people. I have high standards. I remember asking once the board member of a major Islamic organization, I asked him, what teacher or sheikh or Islamic thought do you follow in the Islamic work you're doing? And his response was, no one. And why should that matter anyway? Well, it actually matters a great deal. When you're in the honored position of representing Muslims as a religious community, we're not an ethnic community. We're a religious community with values and with ethics and a prophetic tradition, right? It's incredibly important that you follow Islamic ethics and adab and how you do the work. And it matters a great deal that the purposes and goals of the work are aligned with prophetic traditions, right? And so all of the initiatives that Muslims have taken up in the country, I think, fall primarily in two categories. One is the political and civil rights initiatives, and the other, what I call service initiatives. Now, the work of ING and the work of Pacifica falls in the latter, and I'm going to go into that. At least I think that Pacifica's work falls in the latter. And I'll be talking about both. The political and civil rights initiatives, where we're fighting for our civil rights and pushing for policies and new laws that impact Muslim Americans, are no different from how the Prophet, peace be upon him, and all the Muslims since have defended the security of Muslims. It's incredibly important work, which I really can't speak to because I don't do it myself. It takes a certain type of personality and character, which I don't possess, but I can offer observations. And the following, I think I have three major critiques. One is that it's incredibly important not to rely on these strategies as silver bullets to solve all of our problems. Besides defending our community, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was also engaged in building our community from within and making sure people were fed and clothed, that they were informed about Islam within their own and in surrounding communities. And he was also busy fortifying the nascent community by making treaties and building allies, right? I think some of the political civil rights activists in this area tend to look down upon or not take seriously all other work except their own. I think Muslims are really invested in political and civil rights work, as we should be, but they shouldn't see it as being the silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. So what is needed here is humility by all of us, including me. And I also remind people that we've had civil rights laws on the books for decades. We've had minorities in the highest positions in government, President Obama, for example. And yet we still needed a Black Lives Matter movement to address Black American concerns in our day and age. We're still dealing with anti-Semitism, anti-Asian, anti-Latino bigotry, even though those groups have been here for centuries, where we've had all of these civil rights laws for decades to protect them. And they've held positions in the highest branches of government. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that we need to dismantle institutionalized racism. Otherwise, we're just recycling. We're just sort of repeating history. That dismantling institutionalized racism won't happen, can't happen without massive and widespread re-education of the American public. And that includes our own people who have internalized racism against each other and other minorities, right? Black Muslims talk about this all the time in the kind of racism that they face inside Muslim communities, right? My second critique is related to the first. We need to work for civil rights alongside other groups who are suffering equally or more from bigotry on common causes and issues. So we must not focus only on ourselves. Only then do we become a community that is serving both ourselves and America as a whole when we're actually addressing bigotry across groups. And my third critique is the problem with framing ourselves as victims in political and civil rights work. I think victimization has long-term negative impact on our psyche and on our relationship with other Americans and with America itself as a political entity, where we're going around demanding things, it concerns me. It can be very damaging in how we view ourselves, and may even engender, for some people or a lot of people that don't speak for themselves, feelings of isolation, marginalization. It can make us feel like we don't really belong here as Americans. And we are Americans. We do belong here, right? And so those are my critiques of the civil rights, political activism kind of work that I hope is considered. The second initiative that I'm personally engaged in, and which really resonates with my personality and character and why I do what I do, is to counter Islamophobia through the service route, which includes many initiatives ranging from relief work, soup kitchens, free health clinics, all the way to education and peacemaking work, such as the interreligious engagement work that ING does, that Pacifica does, and other groups do. The Prophet, peace be upon him, built a community by making sure people were fed, by educating them and others about Islam, and by doing the work of peace building with other tribes. And we have to do the same. We have to invest, I believe, far more in this area, in this space of work than in the other space. I think that Americans will ultimately come to appreciate Islam and Muslims through this area the most when we're working not just for ourselves, but for the betterment of America as a whole. In the area of education where I'm invested, two factors should be considered for anyone doing this work. One is the kind of Islam you're teaching, and two, how you're teaching it. Okay? So my organization emphasizes, I have an academic degree from Stanford University in religious studies, and I've also studied with Shuyukh, ever since I became a practicing Muslim for 25 years. I've studied with several traditional scholars. My organization emphasizes a non-essentialist view of Islam that addresses the diversity of Muslims and the plurality of opinions that are out there, especially as it concerns issues, for example, on women and other, hot topics that we're often asked about. We have to consider the fact that Muslims are nearly 2 billion people, and they live in 50 Muslim majority countries with their own history, with their own culture, with their own traditions. And then we have sizable minorities all across the country: China, Russia, the United States, Europe, and so forth. So there is diversity. We're not a monolithic group, and you have to project that when you are, when you're teaching about Islam. And we also emphasize teaching about Islam in the context of religious pluralism, which is an American value. So we do it alongside Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, and Jews. Because the more that Americans understand their own religions, or the religions that they're more familiar with, which would be Judaism, perhaps, and Christianity, the more that they're able to understand Islam and its diversity. Just in the same way that Christianity has, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Orthodox Christianity, and within each of these you have 10,000 denominations in the Protestant tradition alone, or more, right? You have diversity in the Catholic tradition, and certainly in the Orthodox tradition. Once Christians understand that, they can begin to understand the diversity that also exists within Islam. And we do the same thing when we address Islamophobia. We do it by looking at the long history of anti-Muslim bigotry and how it's related to other forms of bigotry. Our situation is not an isolated situation. And this is why on these panels, we invite other groups who are impacted by the same issues. So we speak alongside Blacks, Black Americans, Asian Americans, Native and Jewish Americans, and tell the historical story of how these negative perceptions were constructed in the first place in the colonial period, and how they came to be institutionalized in the last several centuries through education and other forms of popular culture. ING believes that it's really important to know this history to be able to effectively dismantle racism, which is based on policies that are reinforced by ignorance, right? I think many Americans, I'll give you an example, I think many Americans really believe that certain groups of people, like say African Americans or Muslim Americans, belong in the position they do in society because they deserve it, because they can't do any better. So when a teacher tells a bullied Muslim child, I won't stop the bullying because I think your people deserve it for starting wars against us, which is something that actually happened in San Francisco. That's an expression of gross ignorance that is based on what she believes about Muslims. So not only do we have policies in education that erase Muslim history, they're not teaching about Muslim history in the curriculum, or they're teaching it poorly. That policy is now reinforced by that teacher and probably by most of the adults in her school who believe that the only history you should be teaching about Muslims relates to violence and terrorism and jihad and so forth. And this is in fact an issue that which many Islamophobes are promoting, saying that you can only teach about Islam if it's in the context of terrorism or what they call jihadism. Otherwise, you're being a disloyal American, or you're erasing the history of Islam, which is an outrageous claim on so many levels, right? Islam, as I said, is embraced by nearly 2 billion people living in 50 plus Muslim majority countries. And to say that you should only teach about Islam in the context of terrorism is problematic, to say the least. And so while it's important that we work to improve the system of education to do a better job in teaching about all groups equally, or by having an ethnic studies class, which is a good start, but only a start, what we can do immediately, right? If you're trying to change the education system, that would be called dismantling the racism that exists in that institutions. That's going to take a long time to do, and it needs willing parties to participate with us to do that. What we can immediately do is educate the public about the roots of racism and why we hold the wrong perceptions that we do about entire groups of people, such as Muslims, Blacks, Asians, Latinx, Jews, and so forth. And when you educate people, you're actually empowering them to do something about it now, to change how we teach about diverse groups of people until the system of education can do a better job in teaching about all the diverse groups that make up the United States. And this is just sort of one, brief example of why it's incredibly important when you're teaching that you teach alongside other groups that are facing the same kinds of problems that Muslims are. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry about going probably over time.
No, it was beautiful. Thank you, Maha, for this beautiful, elaborate view of how Islamophobia is viewed, the definition from the start, and how Muslims are doing in the West, especially. And in your ING, like explanation of the ING, there's a special emphasis of providing face-to-face education.
Right.
I think that's pretty important. And that's what you've been doing in the last few weeks with with the amount of people that you came face-to-face online. There's this question that came through our social media. The question is, what is the most effective method to counter Islamophobia in your many years of experience?
So as I said, there is no one silver bullet. I think people always look for that, and there isn't one thing. I think that Muslim Americans with our allies need to work on all fronts. So I absolutely think that that requires doing the political and civil rights work, as well as all of the service work that I talked about. And education is essentially a service that we provide, right? We are not teaching Muslim kids. We're out in the public square doing education about Islam and Muslims. I personally believe that Americans have a right to know the truth. They have a right to know because they're making policies based on the information that they have. Education system, we all know, has deteriorated over maybe the last 5 decades or more, and teachers need all the help that they can get. And so we view our organization as being very service-oriented in that, we serve teachers, we serve trainers in corporations, in healthcare facilities, in law enforcement agencies. We serve synagogues and churches in their adult education programs. And this is our core competency. I mean, we're academics. We are practitioners. Of the faith. We understand the law, separation of church and state. We have allies that we work with, and we're all working together, towards better education, better understanding of diverse religious groups, and for a better America. So I think we need to do it all. We can't. There is no one silver bullet, and I think people often look for that.
Yeah, like your emphasis on the silver bullet, that we don't depend on the miracles, but we need to work. We need to pull our acts together.
Oh, absolutely. Honestly, this is the most important thing that we could do. I wish I could take all of the activists. We've had a surge of young activists because of a lot of work that was done in training them and giving them the platform to express themselves and to know how to do that. I wish that we had the same kind of training on Islamic values and Islamic ethics, and just generally adab. To look at things from an Islamic lens, not always from a critical race theory. Critical race theory is important, but there's also an Islamic perspectives on these issues that I think that we also need to consider. Islamic ethics are probably the most important to me, and how we lead, how we work with the people that work with us, how we interact with each other. We're not in a competitive race. It's crazy, We're not. And we need to be working with a greater community, with Jews, with Christians, and with Hindus and Buddhists and everybody that is willing to work with us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you elaborate beautifully. Thank you for that. And another question comes to mind. I'll do an intro to that. For the kids who are born here and who are growing here, they have a special sense of ethics, and then they have a special sense what racism is, what ethics is, and what good morals is. But some of us who are kind of born in another country and then stepping in here, we have some kind of internalized racism. This question goes to that. Now, here we have Islamophobia. Back in Muslim majority countries, we have minorities oppressed, and there's a kind of internalized racism you're talking about. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I think we all of us have been colonized by Europeans, and we've been racialized. We judge each other based on the color of our skin, which is why my Turkish grandmother would often refer to African Americans as abd this and abd that, and I mean, as a kid, I didn't even know what it was until I was a little older. Like, where did she get this from? My mother, same thing towards non-Arabs, right? And so, I think unfortunately we picked that up from colonialists, and we've integrated it, and we judge each other based on the color of our skin, and even within the Egyptian culture. And I don't know about. I think most Turks are probably all white, but within North Africans, Indians and Pakistanis, the lighter skinned you are, the more beautiful you're considered to be, and so forth. So we've internalized racialization, unfortunately. I think this generation is much better. The generation that has that has grown up here, and they see this, and I grew up seeing this in my own family, and that's I saw, and I felt it was just a lot of hypocrisy there, a lot of things that didn't make sense in terms of what they preached about, being good Muslims and so forth, but they themselves weren't. The mosques didn't reflect Islamic values. I always heard them complain about this or that, and for that reason, I actually didn't want to have anything to do with Islam. I grew up pretty secular. I only come to Islam much later in my life, in my late 20s, early 30s, and I had a spiritual experience, reading the Quran and interacting with Muslims, and that's why I do the work that I do. Two inspirations came from my reading of the Quran at the time. One is, people need to know about this. I had no idea, because all of the stereotypes that I'm working against are stereotypes that I had as a kid about Muslims, about misogyny towards women, about, they hate Christians, they hate Jews. Not true, right? About lack of independence, lack of individuality, all of those stereotypes that we know Americans have, a lot of young people, a lot of Muslim Americans have. I was one of them. And so I read the Quran, I begin to interact with Muslims, and I discover they're exactly the opposite, and my inspiration to start ING comes from the fact, we need to teach, because Americans have a right to know, not to convert. I don't care about converting. I care about people just knowing the truth about who the Prophet Muhammad was, peace be upon him, what the Quran is, that we worship the God of Abraham. We don't worship some pagan god, right? And this is that we have a theology of pluralism. We've always had good relations with other religions. And my second inspiration was that Muslims need to be doing this work. Where are the Muslims? Why aren't they out here doing this work? This was right around the first Persian Gulf War when I started the organization. And I wish I had grown up knowing all that I know today about Islam and Muslims, but I didn't, because I just didn't. My parents, I don't think, did a good job in that area. They were great parents. I believe that I have the adab because I'm probably as old as you. So I think that I grew up with with Islamic culture in terms of my adab. I still stand up when a person walks into the room, when an elder walks into the room, right? Kids today, they don't do any of that. Kids today will just tell you exactly what they think, and they don't care about age. It's just shocking to me sometimes. But at least my parents instilled adab, Islamic adab.
Yeah. Yeah. As you elaborate, like Islamic adab and Islamic ethics is kind of very important for us to internalize, get rid of our biases that we hold dear. When we are fighting Islamophobia, we shouldn't have internalized racism while we are talking.
Exactly. Internalized racism, and then also Islamic ethics and how we interact with each other. We need to be people that are compassionate and merciful. I mean, this is when I read the Quran for the first time, and I read it all the time. This is what comes through to me. It isn't about justice this and justice that. Justice after you've instilled compassion and mercy, and you've exemplified the character of our prophets, particularly the Prophet, peace be upon him, and you truly have love for others, as you want them to love you, and that you love Allah, you love the Prophet. All of those things are like necessary before you do anything. Otherwise we're just a chaotic community, and I don't think we're going to be effective. And we need to have a full-fledged program that we're putting every volunteer through. We're putting every board member of Islamic organization. We're putting every executive director of a nonprofit organization. Listen, I'm not perfect either. I don't want to project myself as being somebody who's mastered it all. It's a constant struggle, but it's something that I definitely work on, and it's something that I really credit Sheikh Hamza Yusuf for, because I think he definitely instilled that in all of his students. I studied with him, and he absolutely instilled the importance of purification of the heart, that this is where you need to begin, right? And this should be the basis of everything that you do in this world.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the beautiful answers that you've shared with us. There are several questions that came through social media, but we don't have time for this.